Thank you for listening to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. If you'd like to contact me, please email me at rearviewmirrorchronicles@gmail.com. A man in love. A man who feels the dear disease, forgets himself, neglects to please. The crowd avoids and seeks the groves, and much he thinks, when much he loves. Pressed with alternate hope and fear, sighs in her absence, sighs when near. The gay, the fond, the fair, the young, those trifles pass unseen along. To him a pert insipid throng, but most he shuns the vain croquette, contempts her false affected wit. The minstrel's sound, the flowing bowl, oppress and hurt the amorous soul. 'Tis solitude alone can please, and give some intervals of ease. He feeds the soft distemper there, and fondly courts the distant fair. To balls the silent shade prefers, and hates all other charms but hers. When thus your absent swain can do, Molly, you may believe him true. Hello, I'm Keith Ogden, an author and a public historian, and of course, that poem was by the great Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who was an illustrious English writer and poet, a woman who defined the conventions of her time with her fearless intellect and adventurous spirit. Renowned for her vivid letters from the Ottoman Empire, she introduced the practice of smallpox inoculation to Great Britain. Not Edward Jenner, as everybody thinks, therefore transforming medical history. She was rather amazing. Her wit and eloquence shone through her poetry and her correspondence, basically challenging societal norms and advocating for women's education and autonomy. And Montagu's legacy endures as a pioneering voice of enlightenment, blending cultural exploration with a steadfast commitment to progress and equality. And I bet you've never heard of her, have you? So Lady Mary was lots of things, but she was also our first ever female travel writer. And she wrote a series of letters from Constantinople, which made her not necessarily famous in her day, but very, very famous indeed after they were published just after her death. She's also very beautifully written about in a book titled Daughters of Britannia by the amazing authoress Katie Hickman, where she is actually on the front cover. Lady Mary, that is, not Katie Hickman, dressed in a Turkish dress. Again, Lady Mary. And the extraordinary thing about that painting, it's a beautiful painting. But interestingly, all of the men that I showed it to said, yeah, she's not that good looking. In fact, she's quite ugly. And all the women said, oh my gosh, she's actually got the most interesting face I've ever seen. I actually think that she's very beautiful, not that it matters, but I happen to think that she is. So she was born in 1689, and Lady Mary spent her life in England. She was born into this incredibly aristocratic family. So she was actually born Mary Pierpoint, and her father was successively an earl and then a duke. And her mother was also incredibly aristocratic. She was daughter of the Earl of Denbigh and also exceedingly rich. So Lady Mary, when she was born, she wasn't so much born with a silver spoon in her mouth as a solid gold ladle. Aristocratic, rich, and when she was young, she was supposed to be incredibly beautiful. So she had all these amazing blessings. When you talk about people who have been slightly dipped in the gene pool, well, Lady Mary was one of those people that swam in the gene pool and came out incredibly well. But she also had a number of things that went against her. First of all, she was born a woman, and she was born very, very clever. And clever women in the 18th century get a pretty raw deal because nobody thought that their education was very important. And so she was hardly educated at all when she was very young. Later in life, she said she had one of the worst educations in the world. And so, although she became extremely literate, she was totally self taught to the degree that, she had read all of the playwrights and all of the novels and so forth by the time she was about 14 years old and became obsessed with Ovid's Metamorphoses. And she also taught herself Latin in a cupboard at night. Her dad, the more I read about him, the more I concluded that he was an absolute git. He didn't think that she was worth educating at all, but he did have a very well-furnished library. So he was one of the leading Whigs of his age, one of the leading Whigs in the country, actually. So although he gave the appearance of being very literary, he actually wasn't. Lady Mary later said that she wrote between the hours of 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., and nobody would go into the library during that time or actually be in the house and actually read books that were completely untouched. My dream, really, it is. And when she was quite young, her greatest ambition was to be an abbess, so she could just sit in a corner and read and learn. And I would also say probably not be bothered and, not have to marry if she didn't want to. But here's an interesting thing, and it's a little bit of a dogleg fact, but quite an interesting one, I thought. The only thing that she was really taught in a solid, comprehensive way was the art of carving. Yeah, you heard me, carving. So she had a carving master who would go to her house 3 times a week. And this was a regular thing within the Pierpoint family. And I'm talking about carving meat. I'm not talking about, carving statues or ice carving or doing anything that artistic. But there were whole manuals given over to, the correct way in which you should carve a chicken or fowl or fish or the Sunday roast. And this was something that an aristocratic household, you had to have someone there who was actually able to do it because they entertained so much. And it was almost a sort of performative art. It was almost like a piece of theater. So she wasn't allowed to dine with her father and his political friends, but she would be brought in to do this piece of performance art. I guess that's what you'd call it. And this was a strange fact that I discovered just the other day, that there is actually something in Great Britain called the hereditary Grand Carver of England. How strange is that? But true. Only in England. And her maternal grandfather, who was the Earl of Denbigh, was the hereditary Grand Carver of England. So this could be a reason why she was given this strange form of education. She wasn't taught Latin. She certainly wasn't taught Greek, but she was taught how to carve a jolly good roast. She's also being groomed to be a wife and the lady of the house. And the grooming starts really early because her dad, said Git, started grooming her at the age of 7. He's also part of the infamous Kit Kat Club, which is a sort of, louche group. Now, just as a segue, some time ago, one of my listeners actually asked me what Whigs were, and I can't remember what the conversation was about. But Whigs were actually a political party in the parliaments of England, Scotland, and Ireland, so effectively Great Britain. So between the 1680s and the 1850s, the Whigs actually contested power with their rivals, who were the Tories. And the Whigs eventually merged into the Liberal Party with the Peelites and the Radicals around about 1850. So that's who the Whigs were. So the Kit Kat Club, all these sort of, the great minds of their day, and usually also very drunken minds at that. They do this thing where every year they toast the Belle of Britain, the most beautiful woman in England. And they toast her Lady Mary as the finest filly, who, I have to say, was only aged 7 at the time. Now, look, I know it was different times and different places, but even at age 7, there's just something not quite right with that, is there? So the other men, apparently, when her father put her forward as an idea, said, well, we don't actually even know what this young woman looks like. So go and get her up, get her out of bed. So she was woken up by her servants at around 4 a.m. in the morning, dressed in all her fine clothes, and taken to the tavern where the Kit Kat Club were having this drinking session, and she was then toasted as this great beauty. But it was also the kind of thing in the 18th century that you did, that you gave toasts to, beauties. And many of these great beauties were courtesans, very famous courtesans. And obviously she wasn't in that category, but, the sort of looseness, there was a kind of tinge of looseness about the whole notion of toasting this great beauty. Anyway, that happened to her when she was 7 years old. I don't think her father was a particularly great father. So the father, who is one of the great intellectuals of the country, self-declared, I might add, self-declared, decides to marry her off to a man with the most, fantastically sort of dim-sounding name of Clotworthy Skeffington, the first Earl of Masserine. I kid you not. Very little is actually known about him. And I think that people are actually so stunned by his name when they hear it that they actually forget all the other facts. Anyway, Lady Mary really, really didn't want to marry this man. She said, and I quote, she'd rather give her hand to the flames. In other words, her hand to the flames of hell than be married to this particular man. Her father was trying to force her to marry Clotworthy Skeffington, but she was actually having illicit correspondence with another man by the name of Edward Montagu. Actually, his full name was Edward Wortley Montagu. And Mary had actually been a very good friend of his sister's. He had a sister called Anne who'd died, who was this friend of Mary. And after her death, Mary actually carried on the correspondence with her brother. And it's a curious thing because when you read the letters, which all still exist, they actually debated, literally for several years, whether or not they were going to get married or not. And actually, they did go further, and there were marriage negotiations that started between Montagu and Lady Mary's father. But they kind of stumbled on the financial details. This was actually a very important thing because Montagu, although he came from a very good family, he wasn't overly wealthy. He was wealthy, but not overly wealthy. And you read in later letters, there's a rather sad thing that she wrote. She actually said, "My people, in a way, sell their daughters as slaves, and I cannot tell what price my master will put upon me." And if you read the letters of the time, they literally talk about Lady Mary in poundage. Not as in her weight, but as in the British pound. They talk about her being a 10,000 pounder or a 15,000 pounder. And keep in mind, they were dynastic families, especially at her level of society. So dynastic marriages had to take place. And they were supposed to happen basically because of the consolidation of family finances. And people's feelings, especially Lady Mary's feelings in this particular instance, were never, ever taken into account. So look, Montagu, as much as he proclaims his love for her, haggles like a market fishmonger over the bride price. He wants more money. He wants more money to marry the woman that he's supposed to be in love with. And look, he's actually a bit of a catch. I mean, he was a politician. He's fairly aristocratic himself. And as I mentioned, he's also rich-ish. His grandfather was the first Earl of Sandwich, and his mother was illegitimate. But because he's illegitimate, he's not extremely rich, but he is rich, and his mother was eventually paid off by the Earl of Sandwich. And that's how they actually acquire the name Wortley. And it's a condition that he absolutely insists that they add into the family name of Montagu if they're to be married. So he's this politician. He's sort of a literary person. He's got this slight literary bent to him, and he's friends with people like Addison Steele, who's a great man of letters. And so I think this is one of the main attractions for Lady Mary. When you dig deeper, though, it's actually quite hard to see what the full attraction was, because in their letters, they don't really agree about anything at all. There's an awful lot of haggling about whether she's going to have a dowry or not. She argues back and forth. And then, of course, there's the whole discussion that goes on with her father, and her father eventually says no, that, Wortley Montagu is no good, effectively because he just wants more money and he won't agree to my terms. So you're absolutely going to marry Clotworthy Skeffington. And the rest of the story kind of takes on a picaresque novel aspect to it because there's a slight hitch in the details. I mean, this isn't done and dusted with Clotworthy Skeffington by any manner whatsoever. But effectively, her father has agreed to it. They've agreed to the dowry and so forth, which, as far as her father's concerned, that's the most important thing. But here's the thing. Clotworthy actually lives in deepest, darkest Ireland. And so the marriage contract has to keep on being returned to Ireland because there's faults in it. Things need changing. And it has to be rewritten and re-signed and so on. And that actually takes a little bit of time. And in that little space of time, the Edward Montagu and Lady Mary thing that's going on the other side that her father knows nothing about, well, they decide that they're going to elope together because this is the only way that she's going to get out of this hideous marriage with Clotworthy. But it all goes kind of funnily, horribly wrong. So one night, the night that they've actually agreed to elope, she goes out on the balcony and she shuts the door, she locks herself out, and she's shivering on the balcony of her house. And suddenly, the night disappears. It's 6 a.m. in the morning, and she's waiting for Edward Montagu, and he doesn't turn up. So she's then discovered by the servants, and she's taken pretty much under lock and key in her brother's carriage down to the family house in Wiltshire. And Edward Montagu does eventually turn up on his horse. He's had issues with his horse, a flat tire or something, a lame leg. And he's pursuing them. And they later realize that they'd actually both spent the entire night in the same country inn without actually realizing that the other one was there. And of course, then she's taken into this house in Wiltshire. And so the whole thing, this whole episode has this kind of Keystone Cops feel about it. But look, she did end up marrying him, and she also laid out the terms of her relationship with him in a way that is so feminist and so modern because she actually talks about love. And she says, look, I actually don't know if I do love you. But let me just read from one of her letters. She says, I don't know whether I can love you. And then she sort of lays out her terms of, what she thinks marriage is going to be like without love. And she says, make no answer to this. If you can like me on my own terms, then that's actually fine. And I found that really amazing. Like, don't you think that's amazing? She knows what she wants. He has prospects. He definitely has prospects. And, very soon it becomes apparent that she did make the right decision for her. And that's really important. And this is just before, Montagu is actually about to make something of himself, and something life-changing happens to the beauty that is Lady Mary. So just before they are set to leave for Constantinople, she contracts smallpox. The year before, it actually killed her brother. And actually, she very, very nearly dies of smallpox. But she manages to just cling on to life. But she does recover, but she's completely lost her looks in the proceeds. And for any woman, but particularly for a woman in her station, in her situation, this amazingly popular society figure, it's a personal catastrophe. And cruel things were written about her by her friends. So let me just tell you a little bit about her circle of friends, because there were some really influential names in her circle who were completely beastly to her at this point. She comes to London and she's very caught up with various social events because, this is the time of the Hanoverian court. And of course, Lady Mary was accepted at court, but also she's made friends with a lot of literary men, such as, most significantly, a guy by the name of Alexander Pope, a dramatist, John Gay, and she was part of this literary coterie of principally men. And I think she was actually the only woman there. And this was the age of scandal. Think of Bridgerton. The TV show Bridgerton. This is exactly at that time. It's Bridgerton all over. So it was the age in which people wrote very freely about one another, and they didn't pull their punches. And so Lady Mary, when she's recovered from this threatening disease, one of the things that happens to her is that she's lost all her eyelashes. And keep in mind, this was a woman who'd once been considered one of the great beauties of London society. And after smallpox, she's no longer a beauty. She'd lost her eyelashes, which never ever grew back. And also her face was very badly pitted. And so there's something written about her that I'll read to you. Just one line. They said she was full of pox, but not pitted. In other words, not pitied. And that's quite a telling line. People then had absolutely no compunction whatsoever about writing really cruel, vicious things about their friends, about physical deformities in particular, or physical problems. And they were not considered subjects that couldn't be touched upon. They absolutely went for it. And her friends were absolutely awful. And one of her friends, Alexander Pope, anonymously called her a poke-marked staffy. And of course, things between her and Pope actually heated up much later on. And I'll cover that much later on. But at this stage, he's writing anonymously about one of his best friends. And, as I kind of dug deeper into this, I wondered if she was actually aware whether gossip had actually got to her that Pope and his ilk were actually talking and writing about her, because some of her best letters, some of her best correspondence when she was in Constantinople, and even before she went, were actually between her and Pope. And I don't think she was. I think he did all of this behind her back. And I think that Pope's real vitriol was actually reserved for later on, when they properly kind of fell out in the 1730s. So we're definitely going to come back to that because it's quite appalling. But he certainly used her pock-marked face as a stick to beat her with in society. And this really surprised me as well. Her husband, who, by the way, is very soon about to become the ambassador to Constantinople, says about her at this time, "I should be overjoyed to hear your beauty is much impaired." I mean, can you imagine saying that to your wife? "And I am happy for your displeasure for it, which will lessen than your number of admirers in London." I mean, what a charmer. Anyway, I guess when you think about it, he was her chance to not to be married to someone who she actually disliked, Clotworthy. And I think that she just didn't know Montagu very well beforehand, before they married. And he actually turns out to be cold. He's quite the cold fish. And they never really seem to have loved one another at all. Even in the early days of their marriage, she was always writing to him as he's, traveling to Constantinople and then traveling back again, that he's abandoned her up north. And in her early letters, they're actually very sad because she actually says, you never reply to my letters. And he never does. It's even though they're married, it's a form of spousal abuse. And she talks about how lonely she is up north without him. So here she is in this kind of crackers marriage with not a very nice man who in 1716 is to become the ambassador to the Sublime Court of Constantinople. Let's just have a break, and please join me after the break when we find out what Lady Mary made of her incredible new life. Orthodomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa, but they are much more than that. When you sign up with Orthodomus, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia, and that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Orthodomus or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. Welcome back. So her husband, who we all hate, has been made the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, to Constantinople. She has to get there, doesn't she? And, that's not just like catching a flight these days. It actually takes a while. So they have to catch a ship to Rotterdam, and then they made their way over Europe to Vienna. And she spent quite a lot of time in Vienna amongst the ladies of Vienna. And she wrote beautifully. She wrote wonderfully about how monstrously large their headdresses were. They were a yard high and they were covered in gorse, and that their faces were so amazingly painted and everything, and the jewelry. And she writes incredibly well about, the court of Vienna. And to be quite honest with you, without letters like this, we would have very little idea of what court life was like back in those days. I should also actually say that at this point, I'm talking about letters, but they're not really letters at all. They're not letters as how we think of letters. She used letters that she wrote home to her friends and her family, but they were actually heavily edited, intercut, with sections from her journal. She really crafted, these letters for the use of a better word. You know, they were crafted in that they were highly worked, highly edited, and incredibly well-written articles. So when I talk about letters, just imagine something that's not just a page, but sometimes 10, 15, 20 pages long. And keep in mind, historically, this is the time of the Habsburgs. This is a time of incredible political flux and a time of war. So Lady Mary literally traverses battlefields, you know, on her way from Vienna to Constantinople, freshly made battlefields. And of course, she's also told by everyone in Vienna that the cold, the extreme winter, is going to kill her on her way down to the Balkans. So she's also in this heightened state of fear. You know, you don't only have the winter to worry about, but there's actually battles taking place, and she's riding through them in this carriage. And one of the first things that she comes across after she's left Vienna is the site of the Battle of Peter-Wandine, which was the site of Prince Eugen's great victory over the Turks. And she wrote this. This is a verbatim. We passed over the fields of Karlowitz, where the last great victory was obtained by Prince Eugen over the Turks. The marks of that glorious bloody day are yet recent, the field being strewn with skulls and carcasses of unburied men, horses, and camels. I could not look without horror on such numbers of mangled human bodies and reflect on the injustice of war that makes murder not only necessary, but meritorious. I mean, she writes so incredibly well, and it's from these letters that we have a real inkling to what's going on in the field at this particular time. And keep also in mind, this is also the moment when the Ottoman Empire is beginning to sink before the power of resurgent Europe. You know, we've seen the Ottomans expand into Europe, but this is now the moment of the beginning of the contraction, and she's walking into the Ottoman Empire at a time when they're beginning to be on the back foot. And I'm thinking that they're also probably a little suspicious of Western powers. I mean, it's her husband's job to try and negotiate a position for Britain and an end to the Austrian-Turkish War. I mean, effectively, that's his mandate. So historically, just to give you a bit of context, the Austrians are committed to treaty to support the Venetian Empire, and the Turks were at war with the Venetians. So everyone kind of gets involved. And the British don't want the Austrians to be involved because they wanted Austria to be available to help them against the French. So there's a lot of jockeying for position at this time. It's effectively very complicated three-dimensional chess. So she makes her way from Vienna all the way down to the Balkans, across this incredible scene of devastation, some 660 miles. And amazingly, they were given by the Turks had actually given them this regiment of Janissaries to go with them. Something like 500 men went with them on this journey. I mean, can you imagine? Incredible scenes. And she writes beautifully about how these Janissaries, you know, kind of scour the landscape looking for food for them, and how these, you know, poor peasants in Serbia, who literally have got a couple of sheep and maybe a chicken or two between them to keep them from starvation, and the Janissaries just hoover them up without even finding out who owns them. They literally take everything in their path, like a swarm of locusts, you know, kind of going before. And she feels quite uneasy. And this is really unusual for an 18th century aristocrat. You know, she really feels the pain of these poor peasants as absolutely everything is taken from them. And there's obviously no hope whatsoever of any kind of recompense. And again, it gives us this incredible view, this incredible painting of the juxtaposition from the aristocracy down to the peasants and how they were treated. And I think this is one of the wonderful things about her. It's that despite the name and despite all the aristocratic background, she's a writer like Jane Austen, who immediately talks to us today. She's a feminist. She's intelligent. She's well-read. And she's open to all things. And she doesn't judge anyone. She also makes up her own mind. You know, she's happy to fly against public opinion. And this is so incredibly refreshing about her. It's that all the way through her letters, she's aware that there has been a lot already written about the Ottoman Empire because people are absolutely fascinated by it. That it's so exotic. And there are all these books of travel that exist. And she keeps saying, you know what, don't listen to them. these are written by men who actually don't know what they're talking about. She particularly has it in for Paul Reichart, who's another British diplomat. And she says, I don't know what empire he's visited or visiting, but there's nothing he said that rings true at all to me. Forget him. And that's fantastic. It's great that a woman's actually suddenly taking on these male writers. And with some justification, one of the things is that is so interesting is about the way that she writes, is that she has this knowledge of the female world, a world that they don't have access to. She has the knowledge of the harems and so forth that, male writers have been actually very keen to put to books and to their voyages. But of course, they do it from hearsay, not from first place. And on these travels, and when she gets to Sofia, and she meets these women, and she goes wonderfully into a Turkish bath, and she actually describes the scene of an entire room full of naked Ottoman women, which is something that, all these male painters have been busily trying to paint, and all these writers have been busily writing about without actually seeing it. And she actually sees it. So there's a completely fabulous description. I'm going to read it to you in a little bit. So this was actually in a harem in Sofia, which is then part of the Ottoman Empire. And she gets taken not only just into the harem, but she gets taken into a woman's Turkish bath. And this is what she says. And keep in mind, guys, these places are massive and they're richly decorated. They're decorated better than some of the palaces. So this is what she says. The first sofas were covered with rich cushions and exceedingly rich carpets, on which sat the ladies, and on the second the slaves behind them, but without any distinction of rank by their dress, or being in the state of nature, that is, in plain English, stark naked, without any beauty or defect concealed. Yet there was not the least wanton smile or immodest gesture among them. They walked and moved with the same majestic grace, which Milton describes our general mother with. And of course, by that she means Eve. And I should say that at this stage, this point, she herself is actually fully clothed because, of course, it's not in her cultural makeup to take her clothes off. She then goes on to say, the lady that seemed the most considerable amongst them entreated me to sit by her, and would fain have undressed me for the bath. I excused myself with some difficulty. They are being, however, also earnest and persuading me. I was at last forced to open my shirt and show them my stays and my corset, which satisfied them very well, for I saw they believed I was so locked up in that machine that it was not in my own power to open it, which contrivance they attributed to my husband. And I think that's fantastic. So what she's basically saying is that they think she's in some sort of chastity belt, and effectively it was just her stays and her corset. But can you imagine how unbelievably hot she must have been? I mean, I'm sure most of you have been to a Turkish bath, so you know how high the temperature gets. It gets very hot indeed. So she's actually sitting there sweating profusely and refusing to take her clothes off. What I love about the whole description is that, and it's quite a long description, it's not a titillating description at all. She's actually just telling it what it's like. I was also incredibly impressed by her political analysis. She says, and most modern historians would completely agree with her, the real power lies partly with Ulema, with the Islamic establishment, and partly with Janissaries, and not with the Sultan at all. And of course, this has proved to be right in the years to come, because what you actually see in the ensuing years are endless Janissary revolts during that particular century. And sultans, many sultans are actually deposed by them. And she preempts this with this observation. She actually understands politically from her travels and from her conversations with women exactly what's going on. But she also has an incredible eye for beauty. She understands the beauty of a Turkish garden. She talks and writes about how much the Turks actually value their gardens and the value that they put on a good gardener, just as an example. And of course, keep in mind too, this was the Tulip Age, which is a great moment in Ottoman art and in Ottoman gardens. And Lady Mary was actually completely alive to the aesthetics of it. And she really fell in love with Turkey. She loved being in Turkey. She writes quite joyfully about it. And she comes from this really rather repressed world for women, with what women were actually able to do. And she's sort of liberated in many ways by being away from that and being away from everything that meant. And she's also becoming one of the best travel writers in the world at this stage. And she's also, an unembellished journalist as well. And I wonder whether she knows how important what the observations are that she's making, because what people are saying about the Ottomans, what the men are saying, just isn't true, because this really is a mixed society. She actually says that some of the most powerful people here in Istanbul are the Jews, and that wouldn't happen in our country. No one says that about England at that stage, yet here she is. She's saying it. She's also very good in the way that she goes against Western preconceptions about how oppressed the Islamic women are. And this is actually something that is needed today, but she's saying it back in her time. She states that they're much freer than she is. She says that she actually can't leave her house without someone seeing her or following her or knowing where she's going. But she says that counterintuitively, that wearing a veil, wearing a burqa allows anonymity, and it allows the women in Turkey, in Istanbul, in Constantinople to pursue their affairs and to do whatever they like without their husbands or their husbands' slaves following them. If they are wearing the same garb, there is no distinguishing the great lady of the house from her slave. And it's actually impossible for the most jealous husband to know his wife when he meets her in the street. And of course, no man dare either touch or follow a woman in the street. This perpetual masquerade gives them entire liberty of following their inclinations without the danger of discovery. And she ends by saying that she looks upon the Turkish women as the only free people in the entire empire. So she's very impressed by what she sees. And that's such an interesting observation, because she also talks about the Sultan being a slave of the Janissaries. And she is completely forensic in the way that she drills down on these things. So she can see that that there is an aspect of freedom associated with them wearing veils. But she also notices how financially independent these women are. And I mean, compared to her, keep in mind, she's not allowed to hold property. She's not allowed to have her own money. She's actually saved up her money for when she gets married so that she has her own money to spend, and that she feels like she's a slave when she married, strictly because English women have no rights. But she actually then states, whereas Turkish women, if they have any kind of estate, it's in their hands, and they are free to dispose of their money and their estates as they wish. And I think a really interesting fact now, if you look at Istanbul, the skyline of Istanbul now, 50% of what you see in that skyline was actually built with women's money from this time. And so they're the patrons of the arts, and they do all these kinds of things, and they're able to do it because they have control over their own money, their own finances, which in 18th century Britain, women had no control over whatsoever. And arguably, because she's in this women's realm, this is also the place of gossip and intrigue and the exchange of information. She's never allowed in a room where the men are talking about matters of state. But arguably, she actually knows a lot more about what's going on in the Ottoman Empire through the conversations that she's actually having with these powerful women, the women of the harems, the women in the Turkish baths, than her husband does. I mean, if only he would listen to her. But that being said, you know what? If he did, I don't think he would give her any credence to what she had to say whatsoever. And I think what's also interesting is to compare her observations to a French Huguenot travel writer. And again, both in different ways are countering this idea that's already been prevalent in Western writing about the Islamic world, is that it's a land of oppression. It's a land of slavery. She's saying that women are free. And at the same time, this Huguenot writer, Monsieur de la Montre, writes, "There is no country on earth where the exercise of all sorts of religions is more free and less subject to being troubled than in Turkey." So, at the same time, you have these two writers, very different writers, pointing out that the Ottoman Empire is actually very different to the specter of violence that has been haunting Europe and about which so many myths have grown up. The Ottoman Empire isn't what Europe thinks it is. And Europe is actually saying that the Turks are actually the bogeymen, beating at the walls of Vienna, trying to take everything over. But actually, what she finds is this incredibly cultured civilization, a beautiful, a peaceful place where life is revered, where gardens are loved and admired. And she's writing these letters, these curated, deliberate chapters, travel logs in all but name. And these letters were to some degree very public. They became very public because they're being circulated around the court of London because Princess Caroline, the Princess of Wales, is her great patron. So if you wrote a letter to somebody, and keep in mind, I said to you, sometimes these letters were 10 to 15 pages long, there was always an issue of them becoming public, of someone leaking that letter, because this is the age of scandal. Remember, I said to you, it's Bridgerton all over again. And even though you sent it to one particular person, they would be circulated in very select groups of people that you knew. So the question of whether they were going to be published or not, well, that was something that it was certainly sort of considered a scandalous thing, and not something that if you were Lady Mary, an aristocrat, you didn't want to sully yourself by going into the public sphere and by being, actually published in that way. But you didn't mind if your letters were circulated this way. So what's happening is she's gleaning all this amazing information as an autodidact. Also, rather charmingly, she's learning the language. And in some of her letters, she writes vocabs and translations for people back at home. But then something again, it's the smallpox that completely changes the course of her life. She's had it. Her brother died of it. She nearly died of it. But then she notices that smallpox isn't something that is feared throughout the Ottoman Empire. And the reason for this is that they have a way of engrafting. They call it engrafting. So there's a form of inoculation that happens within the women's quarters. And I'll read a rather famous passage from one of her letters, which is about this procedure that actually happens. And this is what she writes. "There is a set of old women who make it their business to perform the operation. Every autumn, in the month of September, when the great heat has abated, people send to one another to know if any of their family has a mind to have the smallpox. They make parties for this purpose, and when they are met, commonly 15 or 16 together, the old woman comes with a nutshell full of the matter of the best sort of smallpox, and asks what veins you please to have opened. She immediately rips open that you have offered to her with a large needle, which gives you no more pain than a common scratch, and puts into the vein as much venom as she can lie on the head of her needle. And after she binds up the little wound with a hollow bit of shell. And then she goes on to say that the fever begins to seize them after about the 8th day, and they keep to their beds for 2 days, very seldom as many as 3, and very rarely have above 20 or 30 in their faces, by which she actually means the actual pock marks, which never mark, and in 8 days' time, they are as well as before their illness." Now, I know, guys, we all talk about inoculations these days, and it's very kind of passé, but this is groundbreaking stuff because Europe, literally hundreds of thousands of people in Europe die from smallpox at this time. She goes on to say, "There is no example of anyone that has died of it, and you may believe I am well satisfied of the safety of this experiment, since I intend to try it on my dear little son." And she does. She actually goes ahead, which is an incredibly brave thing to do because smallpox, as I said, was this massive killer in Europe, but not in the Ottoman Empire. So the idea that you might deliberately try to expose your only child at that point, your only male heir, for a mother to do that, she must have absolutely believed in the process. Edward, her son, is 5 years old. She actually has another child, a daughter, who's born out there a little bit later. But, the male heir is everything to the aristocracy. And it was successful, and he recovered along with everybody else and therefore had immunity. I mean, it's interesting. Her little boy is there, and she actually describes this in some detail. And there's an old woman who comes in, and they're normally Christians who did this. And she comes in with the walnut shell for engraftment, and they would have had the best of the pus, in their little walnut shell. And they would show up, and they would take a little knife or a needle, and they would say, what vein would you like us to do? And Edward, he goes absolutely bananas, as you think he would. And he actually wouldn't let them get close to him because they look so different to the people that he knew. They speak different. They look a little bit scary, and they don't speak the same language. So here's the thing. The embassy doctor is a guy called Charles Maitland, who's there effectively to observe the process. And then he steps in and says, okay, look, let me help. I've got a lance and I'll make a scratch, so let me do it because I'll be able to calm the child down. And that's effectively what he does. Basically, it's their operation, it's their idea, it's their procedure, but he then goes in and performs it under their supervision and then takes all the credit for it. This would have huge repercussions later on when she returned to London. So they returned to London 2 years later in 1718. And in 1721, there's a massive smallpox epidemic. And lots of Lady Mary's friends and acquaintances actually all die from it. And of course, London's social life, which is everything for the aristocracy, comes to a complete standstill. So Lady Mary decides that she's going to publicly inoculate her daughter. She's going to try and bring this procedure and show her fellow countrymen this procedure and how it actually works. So she arranges to have her little daughter inoculated by the same doctor, Dr. Maitland. So he steps up again because he's done it before and he performs it. But this time he performs in front of an audience. They had to have witnesses because people couldn't believe that someone like Lady Mary would deliberately do this and expose their own little child. And the interesting thing is that she doesn't ask her husband, Edward. She just does it behind his back. So this also gives you some idea of the state of their marriage. So there's an audience there of blue bloods, Lady Mary's friends and acquaintances who watch the entire procedure. And the little girl has the engraftment and they all witness it. They see that she's ill for a little while and then she gets better. And then it becomes the rage of the court, to the point where the Princess of Wales actually decides to inoculate her own children. So the Princess of Wales announces publicly that she's going to inoculate her own children, but then she does a very curious thing, and it's very controversial. This whole engraftment is very controversial. So before that happens to her own kids, they decide that they're going to engraft some criminals in Newgate prison. And they have 3 women and they have 3 men. And look, I don't know whether they volunteered or whether they were volunteered. But it doesn't matter. They get engrafted, these 6 people. And of course, all of them survive. And then they're pardoned. So, literally this inoculation is their get out of jail free card. So at that point, Princess Caroline then decides that she will inoculate her 2 little girls. However, there's a little bit more horror to this story. It's never that simple, is it? So they do the Newgate prisoners who maybe have some agency, but then they do a bunch of orphans. So right around St. James's Palace, they decide to inoculate all these street children. And the thing that made me laugh so much is that these children, when they've recovered, there are actually notices in the press saying that these children are now on display for you to come and inspect them if you want. And there's a very important reason why they do that. These are the survivors of the procedure of engraftment. So if you wanted to, not as a common man, but if you wanted to as a blue blood or as part of the aristocracy, you could go and have a look. You can actually see for yourselves that they were hearty and healthy. And this is the important thing, that they weren't marked by the pox. And interestingly, there's also now this huge kind of warfare in the media, which is split down party lines. There's a modern kind of tale in this, really. So, if anyone was associated with the court, then they approved of this procedure because they'd seen it in action. But the opposition parties and the press associated with them were furiously anti-vax. They were anti-vaxxers. They're the first anti-vaxxers ever. So if you're a Whig, for instance, you thought it was great. But if you were a Tory, you thought it was disgraceful. And what's interesting is that this is one of the last moments that you find Europe learning science from the Islamic world. And the sad thing is that the Islamic world has been developing things like this since the 12th century. And Europe has been learning mathematics and science and astronomy from Islam all the way through to this time. But by the 18th century, that academic boot is now on the other foot, and the direction of learning is beginning to be west to east. And interestingly, you're also finding the same thing happening in India. For example, there's an astronomer called Thomas Dean Pierce at exactly this time in Calcutta, and he's actually hanging out, rather coolly with Muslim astronomers in Lucknow, and he finds that they know about the extra moon of Venus in some detail, and it's not known yet in Europe. And actually, you know what? Astronomy doesn't really come into its own in Europe until Herschel actually builds a better telescope. But by the 19th century, things like this will have ceased to happen. And again, it's one of these transitional moments where the Ottomans are teaching the West something. One of the things that made this procedure controversial was that it was actually considered to have not been scientific, that this was a folk remedy, and also that it was being taught by women. This was done by little old women in a harem. This is how it's actually being interpreted in England. And even the people who were in favor of the idea, and empirically, you can actually see that it worked, but it came via women. And not only did it come via women, it came via foreign women. And there's, as I mentioned before, there's a vicious war that goes on with the pamphleteers. I'll just read one little thing by a pamphleteer called William Wagstaff, because it just shows you the degree of racism and misogyny that was surrounding, this particular thing, which had been introduced by Lady Mary and accepted by Princess Caroline. So there was a female aspect to this that the men didn't like. And this man, a guy called William Wagstaff, who was a medic, wrote this pamphlet. He wrote, "Posterity perhaps will scarcely be brought to believe that an experiment practiced only by a few ignorant women amongst an illiterate and unthinking people should of a sudden, and upon slender experience so far obtained, in one of the most enlightened in capitals nations in the world, as to be received into the royal palace." Many years later, Edward Jenner actually does the same thing when he takes cowpox and engrafts himself. And he does it after seeing how his milkmaids are actually faring and not getting sick with the smallpox. And suddenly it's rediscovered. It's scientifically rediscovered. And then it becomes universally acceptable. To be honest with you, I never knew about Lady Mary Wortley Montagu until I started this research. I never knew that she had anything to do with smallpox inoculations. To me, until I discovered these inoculations, it always started with Jenner. I've never heard of anything other than that. There's a whole world of things that are actually led by the West that come from the Islamic world, which are not attributed to the right sources. So how does it all end? For me, feisty women never seem to have lovely ends. So after this whole controversy about the smallpox, she was embroiled in yet another controversy because she fell out with Alexander Pope, who'd been her great friend, well, supposedly, and her great sort of literary collaborator. And no one actually quite knows what it was about that made them fall out. However, Alexander Pope was this English poet, very famous translator. He was a satirist, of the Enlightenment era. He was actually considered one of the most prominent English poets of the 18th century. But the theory is, and this resonates with me the most, is that he made passionate love to her and that she laughed in his face. Look, from what I've read, Lady Mary was never that cruel, but he was. And I can imagine her laughing at the absurdity of a particular situation. So Pope was actually a very small man. He was only 4'6". And so obviously his height was an issue for him. And she was actually quite tall. She was 5'8". And it's alleged that one day she arrived home from a walk in Hyde Park, and the servants had actually let Pope in, as they always did. And she walked into the sitting room, and there he was, naked, waiting for her, sitting on the chaise lounge. And she's alleged to have laughed in his face. If she did, I'd say that she laughed at the absurdity of the situation. And apparently he then took great umbrage and gathered his clothes and stormed out. And she was very damaged by the crossfire that then followed. So Pope really let rip, and he described her in the most horrible ways in several of his poems, including his satirical poem, The Dunciad, where he actually lampoons at a number of people, not just Lady Mary, but he actually portrays her particularly as being the worst of all prostitutes, who's given venereal disease to her lover. They really didn't pull punches back in those days at all. She kind of hits back anonymously, but, because she's a lady, she isn't supposed to go public, but it really did affect her reputation. So much so that she ends up having to move to Europe. She ended up eventually living in Venice, among other places, and, in other places on the continent, but she kind of settles in Venice. I mean, let's face it, there are worse places than having to settle in Venice, which is one of my absolute favorite cities. And retrospectively, she could have been stuck with Clotworthy in the depths of Country Island. But she sort of ends up in Venice, friendless and alone. I mean, she makes friends, but it's not easy for a single woman, then or now. And when she does die, and some people have suggested that she may have died of cancer, but then her daughter does this really unforgivable thing. She arrives to close her mother's estate, and she burns her mother's handwritten journals and any letters that she can get her hands on. So the question then arises, how do we still know about her amazing letters today? So thankfully, she kept this kind of literary draft of what becomes the letters. These were the letters that she basically reworked and then spliced in with pieces from her diary and so forth. And whether or not she actually intended it for publication, we'll never really know. But it was certainly in a very literary, very beautiful form that she kept them, and that's how we have them now. So Edward Montagu dies, and at this point she decides that she's going to come back to England. En route, she meets and she's holed up with a man called Benjamin Sowerden, and she sort of lives with him for a little while because her maid's very ill. And so she had to make a pause in her journey, and she ended up giving him the manuscript of her letters, the letters that have come down to us, which tells of her amazing life in Constantinople. Which is a kind of a strange thing to do because she doesn't actually know him that well. And she didn't say to him, here's my manuscript, I hope you'll publish it after I'm dead. But she gave it to him nonetheless. And she came back to England, and then she dies, very shortly after that. So Benjamin Sowerden is left with this extraordinary document. And he then went to her daughter, the very prim and proper Lady Boot. And she basically says he can't publish it, not in your life. She'll sue him if he does, he has to destroy it, etc. It's all very scandalous, and they end up coming to an agreement for a price on the document. But before he hands the original document over to them, he has lent it to a friend to read. He was so astonished by its complexity and the information that it contained, he wanted someone else to experience it. This friend then calls in two of his friends, and they copy the entire manuscript that night, in one night. And then a little later, they release an unauthorized copy to the general public, a pirate edition, if you like. And then much later, a great-grandson produces the original version. Thankfully, they didn't destroy it. And of course, there were several errors in the pirated edition, so one of her relatives actually finally makes good. And of course, it's out in print, and you can read it, which is how I found it. Phew. So if you've enjoyed this podcast, then I can highly recommend The Turkish Embassy Letters by Mary Wortley Montagu, published by Eland, afterward by Devla Murphy. And if you want to read about Lady Mary and the other women just like her, the Daughters of Britannia, there's actually a book titled Daughters of Britannia, which is by the amazing Katie Hickman. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this podcast about the most amazing woman who you would never ever hear about, who deserves to be talked about. Thanks very much. Bye for now.